been told that your newborn baby has clicky hips and you're wondering, what's clicky hips? Is it something serious? Do I have to do anything about it? Hi there, it's Neesha from Sydney Kids Physio. In today's video, I'm jumping in to talk about clicky hips, or medically what we call developmental dysplasia of the hips. So what is a clicky hip? Generally, that refers to that clicking sound that the doctor felt when they were moving and checking your baby's hips. Now, developmental dysplasia of the hips actually describes three conditions of the hips in a newborn baby. The hip joint is made of your thigh bone, which makes what we call the femur and the head of femur, and your pelvic bone, which gives you what we call the acetibulum. Now, a healthy hip should have a good coverage where you can see the hip joint and the pelvic joint is looking really well covered over it. There's a nice symmetry of the shape. Developmental dysplasia of the hip refers to when your baby's hips were being formed in your tummy, and perhaps for different reasons, it wasn't well formed when baby was born. So developmental dysplasia of the hips could include where baby's hips are completely outside of that joint. So that's what we call a dislocated hip. And that's terrible. That's very dangerous. And if we don't get that correctly put back into the joint, your baby will not have a hip joint to walk on. So it's very crucial we pick up every dislocated hip. The second type of DDH, developmental dysplasia of the hips, is where we say the hip pops in and out, and that's a clicking they might feel, and that's why they call that a clicky hip. And that's a dislocatable hip, so it pops in and out as you move baby's hip. The third type is subluxable, so the shape of the pelvic bone is a little bit flatter, and so that femur head is just rubbing around like a ball on a spoon, and so it's not coming out, but it's also not very well developed because it's not holding it in that shape where it should be. Again, we need to treat that because we want to deepen that pelvic bone so that you end up with a nice shape of your hip joint that allows you to walk well as you get older. Now, what are the risk factors for clicky hips or developmental dysplasia of the hips? Usually it happens to the firstborn baby because mommy's tummy is still very tight, their muscles. So when baby is, stretching out in mommy's tummy, there isn't enough space. Often, if the baby's a large size baby, so it could be your third baby, but baby's large and you're just being stretched out and baby just was too tight and curled up in your tummy in the last trimester. And that could mean that baby's hips are not well developed because baby was just squashed up in you. Number three, breached. So if your baby's breached with their legs up by their heads throughout your pregnancy, particularly in the third trimester, then you can imagine the hip joints are not being well developed. And not to forget, family history. Now it's really important if mom or dad has a family history of clicky hips. So often we find that moms will say, no, I don't have clicky hips. We didn't have any problems with our hips in our side of the family, but they forget that perhaps the daddy's side of the family has histories of developmental hip dysplasia and nobody's mentioned it. So we've had families come in where the father says, actually, my grandfather or my father had that problem. But when mom was being questioned in hospital, she didn't know that. And so she said, no, there's no hip problems in our family. So it's really important to be aware of the family history on both sides. Now, how do we treat it? Early intervention is key. You do need to see an expert pediatric physiotherapist to get your baby's hips checked. If your doctor says that your baby has clicky hips, or perhaps you have any of those risk factors where baby was breached, it's a large baby or your first time baby or family history, and there's a high risk of baby actually having developmental hip dysplasia, then you must have baby checked, and often your pediatrician will say baby should have a hip ultrasound at 6 weeks old. Now, if you see an expert pediatric physiotherapist, we would be able to check baby's hips, and we would be able to tell you if baby's hips are subluxable, dislocated, or dislocatable. The treatment is pelvic harness like this baby doll is wearing. This is the gold standard, not double nappies. Double nappies will not do anything to help your baby's hips. So a pelvic harness has to be fitted by an expert pediatric physiotherapist. The goal is to get baby's hips in the right position to deepen the pelvic bone so that we have a nice round hip joint that rolls beautifully when you're moving and walking. If you don't do this in time, and often the ideal time is to do it when baby's really little. So we could put babies who are newborn and breached and has a dislocatable hip or dislocated hip into a pelvic harness right from day one. And we would have it for 6 weeks up to 12 weeks, at the end of which we are getting scans at the 6-week mark or 12-week mark, and we will be seeing that nice coverage improving over time. Now, the limiting factor to this is if baby's bigger than what the largest size pelvic harness can be, and often that could be 6 months old, then there's nothing much we can do in terms of using early intervention pelvic harnesses. There are different strategies beyond that, but we don't want to get to there. So if you're out there and you're concerned about your baby's hips, what you need to do is to speak to one of our expert pediatric physiotherapists here at Sydney Kids Physio. The number to ring is 0297904233. And if you know somebody out there who has a newborn baby and they were told baby has clicky hips, why don't you like and share this video with them? Until next time, have a brilliant day. Bye.